Let's take a closer look at a piece of evidence that keeps coming up in this case. The letter. The fake FBI letter. The letter that's fake, but it's not a fake FBI letter. Different people see it different ways. How is it important to this case? In two ways. One, it's part of Manson's allegations in this case in his complaint. So we'll look at what it means, what he says it means for his case. Second, if it's a fake letter and it was authored by the defendants and they were doing something wrong with it, it weighs on their credibility generally. It could specifically for the facts in this case if they were using it as Manson alleges, but even if not, if it still touches on this case, it's a bad fact for the defendants because it shows that they were willing to create a false document, and you don't do that unless you're trying to convince people of something that you otherwise don't have proof for. So not good if that's the case. Let's look specifically at what Manson says in his lawsuit this letter is about. The defendants impersonated an actual agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation by forging and distributing a fictitious letter from the agent to create the false appearance that Warner's alleged quote-unquote victims and their families were in danger and that there was a federal criminal investigation of Warner ongoing. It's the first thing he says about this letter. Then he gets more serious about it in his complaint later on. You get to page 10. Wood and Gore impersonate an actual FBI agent by forging a fictitious letter claiming that Wood and other alleged victims of Warner were in danger. It says they forged a signature and provided a fake phone number. Obviously, they say, and to the best of our knowledge it's true, there was no federal agent involved in writing this letter or giving it to people. There's been no evidence of that, at least. Manson says Wood drafted the text of the letter and asked for and received feedback from Gore. So they were both creating this letter. That Gore aided and abetted Wood, and they were planning to and did use the letter to recruit, encourage, and convince people to claim they were abused by Warner. So that's what he says the significance of the letter is in this case. So now that we know what we're playing with in terms of the value of this for the lawsuit, let's look at what we know about this letter. At first, I'm gonna give you something for your pipe to just stick it in there and tamp it down and smoke on it a little bit as we move through this video, and that is this idea that they're impersonating a federal agent, because that's a crime. So our friends at the Department of Justice say the purpose of this non-impersonation statute is to protect people from fraud and to protect the good name of the federal service. Maybe the ship has sailed on the second one, but if there are any federal agents listening, I'm just kidding. To run afoul of this statute, there are two ways you can do it. And both of them involve impersonating a federal officer. So the first one is you impersonate a federal officer and you act as such an officer. What? So if you're just telling somebody, BSing somebody, yeah, I work for the FBI, bro. I'm like a secret agent and stuff. I do cool things and stuff. It's not actually against the law under this statute. But if you say, I work for the FBI now, I need to be able to come into your home and search it. Now you're breaking the law because you're acting under the authority of this fake persona that you've adopted. The second one is you fake being the cool, suave FBI agent, and you use it to obtain something of value or demand something of value. I'm with the FBI. I need you to give me $200 so I don't have to come into your house and serve this search warrant. If you just give me $200, we can waive that and you can just come down to court tomorrow. I don't want to have to arrest you. If you do that and you're demanding something of value, then that's also a way to break this statute. And, I think it's fair to say it could be done in writing as well. So the question is, did they do that in this letter? Did one or both of these defendants take on the character of a federal agent and then act in that regard? So think about that as we go through the video. Let's get into the timeline of this thing. So in October of 2020, according to Evan Rachel Wood, she's meeting with the other victims that she's identified. It's part of this documentary they did. They did these meetings first in October of 2020. But on the evidence side of things, there's no indication that this letter existed at that point. So there's no indication this letter was used at these meetings or that this letter was used to recruit people into these meetings. In fact, the first time we see this letter come into formation or begin to take form is actually in November of that year, late November of that year. So it's unlikely that this letter existed earlier and was being used with these victims at that time. It doesn't mean that the completed letter couldn't be used. at a later time to help recruit, etc. But the alleged recruiting was already well underway back in October before this letter became an issue. And that matters because I personally, when I examined it, I think this letter was about something else, and I'm going to explain that to you. So on 22 November of that year, 2020, according to a screenshot we have from Brighton Gore off of an iPad that she says she got from her sister, there's a text exchange between Wood and Gore, Ilma Gore, where Wood is sending suggested language for a letter, or it looks like suggested language for a letter, saying, "What do you think?" And Ilma Gore is responding, "It looks good, but you should take out this part about the arrest because, that hasn't happened yet." The good advice. So this language that you see in this text message, that's not the language of the letter that ultimately we end up seeing a copy of. So it appears to be an early draft of that. And it appears to be initiated by Wood to Gore. So that's what we have at that point. But let's look at what it says. This early draft of this potential letter has some language in it that does not appear in the quote-unquote final version, or the ones that were produced in court, and pretty material differences. So look at the text. We have advised Miss Wood that in our opinion, it is in her and her family's best interest to not be in Los Angeles at the time of this individual's arrest and the criminal proceedings. The safety of Miss Wood, her son Jack, as well as other victims, are of our utmost concern during this time. So there's a particular thrust to this language, and to me it's not about recruiting up victims to go to the police about Manson. Instead, it says, you shouldn't be in Los Angeles. Okay, what does that got to do with recruiting victims against Manson? I don't know that. However, in this time frame, Wood also says in her declaration she had decided to leave Los Angeles and go to Nashville and live there, and she wanted to take her son with her. And in December, of that year, 2020, she lets the father know that. On December 22nd, 2020, Wood tells the father that she's going to forward her contact at the FBI. The next day, the 23rd, she sends him a screenshot on Signal app of this letter that we've seen. At least he puts it in court later on, and it's the only one that I've seen. It's the famous letter. Well, he's on that because he's not supportive of the idea that his son's going to be taken across the country, so he tries contacting this Michelle Langer. And he can't do it because this number doesn't go to Michelle Langer, who that is the name of an FBI agent apparently, but this is not her number. And he lets Wood know that, and Wood says, if the number Michelle put on her official letter isn't reaching her, then I would assume the other number is also correct. If Wood were helping Gore, working with Gore, suggesting to Gore language for this letter back in November, and then here it is created, and it's sent to the father by Wood, it doesn't have any letterhead on it. It doesn't reference an actual real federal agency. It clearly is not, to me, written by a member of law enforcement or any of these people involved in it. And Manson says they spoke to the actual agent who said, no, I had nothing to do with this letter, which that's easy to believe. If that's true, what's the excuse for Wood calling this Michelle's official letter? It's not official. It doesn't have the seal of the agency on it. What's official about it? And in fact, it doesn't even have the right number on it. The letter itself, if you look at it, has been watered down substantially from the first version that we saw from November. The December copy that's sent to the father, it drops out the we advise and our concern. It just says the safety of Miss Wood is of the utmost concern. So there's no direct language in here anymore of who's writing this letter, as if it's a first person or people collaborating to write this letter. It becomes very passive voice. It's bizarre. It's very bizarre. There's no letterhead on it. It doesn't direct anyone to anything in particular. It's just almost meaningless now. It's watered down from the first letter, which basically says, law enforcement says you need to get out of Los Angeles right now. You should get out of here. It's too dangerous to be here. That's all gone here. This is extremely vague. And it doesn't say, I, federal agent, say such and such. The problem with this is that Wood says it's Michelle's official letter, and I don't know how she could believe it. She's really going to need to explain that because it just doesn't seem credible. And There is the signature block, Federal Violent Crimes Department, which doesn't exist to anybody's knowledge, and then the name of a real FBI agent, although it doesn't say FBI agent. So, however, Wood had said to the father, I'm going to forward you the name of the FBI contact. And since this is an FBI agent, I can see the connection and this wrong phone number. But there's a signature here. So it does appear that it's being pawned to the father as a legitimate letter, and that's what she says in her email. So this is being pushed out as an actual communication from some kind of federal authority, a federal agent, expressing the concern for safety for Miss Wood, although this concern for safety has been watered down and doesn't say you need to get out of town by sundown. So I'm not aware of anybody who knows or can explain why the text was changed and watered down to the second version. Who was the person who wrote it? Obviously, that's going to be a subject in the suit. But in terms of who was involved in it, well, you've got Wood sending this text to Gore, and you've got Wood as the person sending it over to the father. So she's the one presenting it. There is evidence in Brighton Gore's affidavit or declaration of another screenshot showing a receipt for property from an FBI with a signature on it that Brighton, I think, believes was the signature that was placed onto this letter. And if you look at them, they do look the same to me. It looks like probably whoever signed one signed the other, or maybe they were digitally moved one to the other. I don't know, but it is extremely similar, if not the same. That's tough to tell. But I think that, that indicates participation by Gore in this, because this was on her iPad, according to her sister. And right now, there's no reason to disbelieve that. There's no evidence to disbelieve it. So it looks like there was a collaboration between the two defendants to generate this document in some form, but we don't have the particulars on it. But I think we can see the reason for it, though, right? Because the first version was, you've got to get out of Los Angeles, and that, of course, supports what Wood wanted to do, which was go to Nashville and not have the father fight over it. Well, they do end up in a fight over it, and in fact, the father ends up in a petition at court filing his own declaration and explaining how he got this letter from Wood and the circumstances around it. So it enters format at court, and we're going to walk through that a little bit, because in addition to Wood vouching for this letter to the father, she also had to address it in court at least 3 times that I'm aware of. So it appears the first time Wood addressed this, at least to a judge, was in the Tennessee action that she filed dealing with custody of the child. I wasn't there, so I'm not exactly sure this is what it pertains to, but I think from the context you'll see why I reached that conclusion, that the attorney attempts to move into evidence and Exhibit 18, and then the other side objects to it. The court says, why isn't this hearsay? The judge goes, and the attorney goes, why isn't it? And the court goes, mm-hmm. And then the attorney says, it probably is. Can we just ID it? Well, that results in a further objection. And they're going to talk about this letter, and the court says, well, help me with this. Isn't this going to be hearsay? It'll be double hearsay. Somebody sent her a letter, and then she's going to tell me about it. And then Hayes says, it goes more to my client's intent. It's important to a domicile type issue. What's your intent? The court says, isn't it being offered for the truth that there's an investigation? And that's one of the motivating factors for her staying in L.A., not staying in L.A. So then the court says they'll strike it, and they move on to the next exhibit. I don't think they talked about it anymore, so it really didn't play much of a factor in the Tennessee case. Now, that Tennessee custody battle that Wood filed was eventually dismissed by the court so that it could return to be heard in California. So in March 2021, Wood files a declaration in California in the custody issue, and she says this in paragraph 8. To punctuate the seriousness of the situation, I was provided with a correspondence from a representative of the Federal Violent Crimes Department from the FBI. A true and correct copy of this correspondence is attached as Exhibit 1. The foregoing individuals wrote, and then it says the text that's in the letter that we already know. Please be advised, she's a key witness, etc. Let's go back over that paragraph 8 again. It's a little strange to me. I was provided with a correspondence. How about I was provided with correspondence, or a letter with correspondence from a representative of the Federal Violent Crimes Department a representative. It doesn't say agent. Was this the receptionist? Who was this person? Why not name that person? A representative of the Federal Violent Crimes Department. But there's no department named that. From the FBI. Now here she is straight out saying, everybody's like, well, they didn't claim that it was the FBI. She is saying here it's from the FBI. This is in a sworn document to court. A true and correct copy of this correspondence is attached. The foregoing individuals wrote. So she says she gets a correspondent from a representative, and then she says the foregoing individuals wrote. So one is singular and one is plural. What's going on with this? How many times did this thing get rewritten? I don't know. Something strikes me as extremely odd about that. Nevertheless, she's here presenting this document to the court as a genuine letter that she received from law enforcement from the FBI. This harkens back to Brighton Gore's declaration, which was kind of nagging at me in the last video I did of why did she say that she's heard this conversation between Wood and her sister talking about this letter in April to May of 2021, and that Ilma was on some kind of graphics program moving signatures around. Why did she do that? And it was pointed out to me by some people in the comments that, well, you know, there were some declarations going around at this point. But the declaration I'm looking at from Wood is in March. And Brighton says this conversation occurred in April to May. Now, who knows? You know, there could be a difference in recollection there. And if it were a little earlier, it could explain the appearance of this letter in this declaration. But in terms of cutting and pasting things around, that's slightly bizarre because I've looked at the one from the father in his declaration, and I've looked at the one that I believe was attached by Wood in her declaration. I don't see any difference. So if somebody were recreating this as a second time, they did a fine job of it, and a very fine job of it, because I can't see anything that's in a different position or anything that's different. So I'm not sure what was going on there. Strikes me as very strange situation there, but it does kind of tie together what Brighton said, that there was this conversation going, because I was like, well, what's happening with this letter around that time frame? Well, something in that time frame still involved potentially, you know, with this custody situation. This letter had recently been posted in that, and maybe there had been some discussion for that. I still don't know, but it does put some context to that. So the final time that I see Wood referencing this letter in a legal proceeding is her declaration in this Manson lawsuit, which was April of this year. And she says this about it. I explained to the court my involvement in the criminal investigations of Mr. Warner, why I feared living in close proximity to him. My declaration attached a copy of the, quote, FBI letter, end quote, a redacted version of which is attached to Mr. Warner's complaint as attachment A. So she's saying here, hey, yeah, that one that Warner attached is the same one that I was using in court there. So that also, I think, helps tie down that there's really only one version of this thing floating around out there. I did not distribute the FBI letter outside the scope of my custody dispute, didn't give Warner a copy, and didn't leak it. This is what she says here, which is really on point. I did not fabricate or forge the FBI letter. When I received a copy of the FBI letter, and when I submitted it to the court, I believed it to be authentic. I also did not knowingly make any false statements of fact in my declaration. I believed it to be authentic. Does she still believe it to be authentic? She didn't fabricate or forge it. Did she write some of the text and someone else did it? I'm not trying to read that in there if it's not, but I know these things can be drafted very carefully to deny the narrowest sorts of things and create an implication of denial that's broader than it really is. So I can't say here exactly what all she is denying here, except that she clearly says, I didn't make this thing. So the final product, at least, she's saying was someone else's. You can obviously take a guess who that might be, at least from Manson's side of the equation. But she does, you know, she's standing by it. Hey, I submitted it to the court. I thought it was real. Is that realistic, though, based on the evidence that's out there? This still looks to me really bad for Wood. It really does. And it's one more fact to throw at you, which is when the father was filing his declarations, one of the things he did mention was he didn't just try and call this Langer agent. He also called one of the other people on the letter who did answer the phone and apparently was a law enforcement official who said, yeah, there's a criminal investigation going on and it's with the FBI. So that may poke a hole in terms of claiming that the defendants didn't really think there was an investigation, because even the father, when he made an independent contact with a law enforcement source, was left with the impression that there was such an investigation. So nevertheless, it still is an issue that this letter was created. It doesn't appear that it was created by law enforcement, but it does appear that it was submitted as if it were. That's a big deal. I don't know that it's a strong piece of evidence for Manson's main case of you use this to recruit people against me because of the timing of when it was created and why I think it was created. But to me, at this point, it still leaves a major hole in the credibility of the defendants for having created this thing, if they did. And they're going to need to get into it. The evidence lines up pretty strong to suggest or say that they were the ones who were the masterminds behind it and came up with it and ended up using it in court, or at least would use it in court. Because there is a declaration that the FBI agent says, I didn't have anything to do with it. I think if you just read it yourself, you can see no FBI agent wrote this. I don't know why anybody would think that one did. Yet to me, the amateur level of the letter suggests a hesitancy to go too far in impersonating this FBI agent. There's no FBI symbol on it. The signature is not from a Michelle Langer. The number's wrong and actually went to somebody else that McGore knew. So it's like, well, we want to create this perception, whoever created it, that it is this law enforcement letter and we want to use it, but we don't want to push this thing too far that if somebody just looks at it and says, yeah, that's a total fraud there. Like they wanted some kind of deniability built into it. But to me, that went out the window when you put the signature on it and then you start telling people, yes, it's inside of the custody dispute with the father, but it's outside of court. You sent it on a Signal app to try and change his opinion of what was going on, telling him that it's real. I think this is a big problem for the defendants. But I thought it would be worthwhile to go over what is the situation with the letter, what's its purposes in the lawsuit, what is the timeline of this letter, how it changed, and what its probable purpose was, and the problems that it still leaves for the defendants, even if it wasn't a recruitment tool. So we have to keep an eye on this one. It's a bad fact for the defendants, and let's see how this evolves. Thanks.